They are the ones where restraint forces revelation. He never framed the hearing as a victory. He saw it as a test, one that the nation, not just the individuals involved, was still taking. Trump, equally, would continue to frame the moment as irrelevant, yet its persistence in discourse suggested otherwise. Irrelevance does not echo. That final image, two men seated across from one another, one calm, one defiant, followed by silence, became emblematic of a broader era. An era where information was abundant but answers were scarce. Where confidence often replaced clarity. And where the courage to stay present mattered more than the ability to dominate. In the end, the hearing did not resolve America's divisions. It did not heal its fractures or settle its debates. What it did instead was quieter and more enduring. It reminded people that truth does not need permission to exist. That it does not shout or chase. It waits. And when power is forced to face it, even briefly, the reaction tells a story louder than any speech. The story of that day would be told and retold, not as a clash of egos, but as a lesson in accountability. Not as an argument won, but as a moment revealed. And long after the names faded and the headlines changed, the underlying question remained, persistent and unavoidable, waiting patiently in every room where power is challenged. When truth knocks, who stays seated, and who walks away? It revealed how strength built on control struggles when control is no longer guaranteed. Even those who admired his confidence were forced to acknowledge the cost of walking away. Not because it looked weak, but because it left a vacuum, and vacuums invite interpretation. Over time, documentaries revisited the hearing with softened narration and measured analysis. They spoke less about blame and more about human behavior under pressure. Psychologists weighed in on avoidance and ego. Sociologists discussed how societies respond when leaders refuse accountability. Philosophers debated whether truth requires confrontation or simply presence. Each discipline found something to examine in those few minutes of exchange. In classrooms, students debated whether Obama's question was fair or strategic, whether Trump's exit was principled or defensive. There were no universal answers, and that was precisely the point. The moment resisted simplification. It demanded thought. As the political climate continued to shift, as crises emerged and faded, the hearing remained relevant because it addressed something timeless. Power, when questioned, reveals character. Not through words alone, but through reaction. Years later, when another leader faced a similarly uncomfortable question on a different stage, commentators immediately drew the comparison. Would this be another walkout, or an answer? The public watched closely, more attuned than ever to the subtle signals of avoidance and engagement. In that sense, the hearing had changed the rules, not formally, but culturally. It raised expectations. It reminded people that leadership is not just about projecting confidence, but about absorbing scrutiny without fleeing from it. Toward the end of his public life, Obama would reflect privately that the most important moments are rarely the loudest ones. Time did what it always does, it softened the edges without erasing the shape of what had happened. Months passed, then years, but the hearing never fully receded into the background of political memory. It became one of those moments people referenced without always naming, a shared understanding that surfaced whenever discussions turned to truth, power, and accountability. The image of the empty chair remained especially vivid. Not because it symbolized defeat or victory, but because it represented choice. A moment where engagement was possible, and avoidance was chosen instead. In retrospect, many would argue that the hearing was never really about the two men at all. They were simply the vessels through which a larger tension played out, the tension between performance and responsibility, between certainty and courage. As new leaders rose and old ones faded, the question lingered beneath every public appearance, every press conference, every carefully staged declaration of success. Would this leader answer plainly, or would they redirect? Would they sit with discomfort, or would they leave the room? The legacy of that day was not found in legislation or policy shifts, but in awareness. Citizens began listening differently. They noticed when questions were reframed instead of addressed. They felt the absence when answers never arrived. The hearing had trained an entire audience, not through instruction, but through example. It had shown that composure could be more unsettling than confrontation, that silence could hold more power than noise. Obama's role in that moment became less about what he said and more about how he held space. He did not press relentlessly. He did not escalate when provoked. He trusted that the refusal to answer would speak for itself. That trust, in the intelligence of the audience and the patience of truth, became the quiet center of the story. Trump's departure, on the other hand, came to represent the limits of dominance. Some fight. Some flee. Some wait. And sometimes, waiting is the most disruptive act of all. The hearing did not crown a winner. It did something far more unsettling. It asked the public to decide what kind of leadership they respected, not in theory, but in practice. Loud certainty or quiet accountability. Performance or presence. Assertion or answer. That decision, unlike the hearing itself, was not confined to one room. It followed the nation forward, unresolved, demanding to be faced again and again, each time a leader chose whether to answer, or walk away. What made the moment endure was not that it resolved anything, but that it refused to resolve. It sat uncomfortably in the national conscience, asking the same thing over and over: what does honesty look like when power is challenged? Over time, even some of Trump's staunch supporters acknowledged, quietly, that the moment had been mishandled. Not publicly, not loudly, but in private conversations where certainty softened. They admitted the exit had felt rushed. That an answer, even an uncomfortable one, might have landed stronger than refusal. Others doubled down, insisting that engagement itself would have legitimized the challenge. The country did what it always does, argued. But this argument felt different. It was less about winning and more about explaining why one refused to answer. And explaining refusal is far harder than defending a position. As elections came and went, candidates referenced truth more often, though not always sincerely. Voters became more alert to deflection, more aware of how often leaders speak without answering. The hearing had not created integrity, but it had sharpened awareness. And awareness, once formed, is difficult to erase. Obama, years later, would be asked about the moment in a rare interview. He would not smile. He would not dramatize it. He would simply say that leadership is not proven when things are easy, but when avoidance becomes tempting. He would say that the question mattered less than the reaction to it. Trump, when asked, would dismiss it as irrelevant, a media trick, an insult unworthy of response, yet even in dismissal, the tension remained. Because relevance is not determined by volume, but by memory. And the memory of that pause, of power confronted not by force, but by patience, had settled deep. Historians would later describe the hearing not as a clash, but as a reveal. Not a victory, but an exposure. They would write that it showed how differently leaders behave when stripped of control over narrative. The question itself evolved. It stopped being about its literal content and became a shorthand for accountability. Commentators referenced it indirectly. Citizens echoed its structure in town halls and interviews, asking their own leaders simple questions and waiting to see whether answers followed or deflection took their place. Teachers used it as an example of critical thinking. Therapists referenced it when discussing avoidance behaviors. It slipped quietly into culture, not as a quote, but as a concept. At the same time, the political divide did not heal. If anything, it sharpened. But it sharpened differently. The argument was no longer just about outcomes or ideology. It became about standards. About whether leadership meant constant assertion or the ability to sit with discomfort. Trump's rallies grew louder, his language more forceful, as if volume could fill the space left by that unanswered moment. Obama, when he spoke publicly, spoke less often and with even greater care. Each appearance felt intentional, measured, stripped of unnecessary flourish. Analysts noticed. One side projected strength through dominance. The other through restraint. The contrast was no longer theoretical. It had been televised. In private correspondence later leaked to the press, several lawmakers admitted the hearing had changed how they viewed power. Not in dramatic ways, but subtle ones. They spoke about the danger of surrounding oneself only with affirmation. About how unanswered questions linger longer than accusations. About how walking away can sometimes speak louder than standing firm. The hearing became a reference point in discussions that had nothing to do with Obama or Trump. Corporate boards cited it when discussing leadership under scrutiny. Military academies referenced it in ethics courses. Religious leaders spoke about it in sermons, framing it as a lesson in humility and pride. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the moment refused to settle into the past. Instead, it grew, reshaped by interpretation, replay, and reflection. It became less about the men involved and more about what the encounter revealed about modern power. The country moved on in appearance, news cycles shifted, new controversies emerged, but underneath the surface, something had been unsettled. Political leaders began choosing their words more carefully, not because they feared opposition, but because they feared silence. That was the unexpected consequence. Loud defiance had always been manageable. Quiet exposure was not. In private meetings across Washington, aides replayed the footage not to study policy, but posture. They analyzed the stillness, the timing, the way restraint had forced confrontation without aggression. It wasn't something that could be easily copied. It required patience, confidence, and a willingness to let the audience think for themselves, qualities increasingly rare in an era built on instant reaction. Meanwhile, Trump's departure from the hearing became a Rorschach test. To his supporters, it symbolized refusal to engage in what they saw as provocation. To critics, it confirmed a long-suspected pattern of avoidance when narratives slipped beyond control. But to the undecided, those who lived somewhere between loyalty and skepticism, the walkout planted a seed of doubt that no slogan could erase. They noticed the hesitation before the exit. The pause before the dismissal. The way confidence had cracked just enough to reveal strain. Obama, for his part, did not tour studios or issue triumphant statements. He returned to private life with the same quiet consistency that had defined his presence in the hearing. That restraint frustrated critics who wanted escalation, but it also reinforced the very point he had made. Truth did not need chasing. It waited. As the public digested the moment, something else began to happen. But nearly all agreed on one thing: the hearing had exposed something deeper than disagreement. It had revealed how differently leaders respond when control slips. In universities, political science classes rewrote lesson plans on the fly. Professors played clips and asked students not who was right, but who was composed. Who controlled the moment without dominating it? Who allowed space for the audience to draw conclusions rather than forcing them? What made the moment endure was not outrage, but restraint. Obama had not needed to win the argument. He had only needed to hold the mirror steady. Trump, accustomed to controlling the narrative, had refused to look into it. That refusal became the story. Days passed, but the question did not fade. It surfaced in interviews, in debates, in late-night monologues. Not because people cared about its literal content, but because of what it symbolized. The expectation that leaders, when challenged, owe the public clarity, not theatrics. Some called it unfair. Others called it overdue. But no one called it forgettable. The hearing did not end careers. It did not rewrite laws. It did not produce immediate change. What it did instead was subtler and more dangerous to power: it forced reflection. And reflection, in a world built on certainty, can be disruptive. Long after the cameras moved on, long after the statements were archived, the moment remained. Not as a shout, but as a pause. Not as an accusation, but as a question still waiting to be answered. And that, many would later argue, was precisely why it mattered. Yet even among critics, few denied the effectiveness of the moment. It had forced a reaction, not just from Trump, but from the nation. Late that evening, political historians were invited onto panels usually reserved for election nights or national crises. They spoke carefully, aware that history often looks different with time. One historian noted that moments like this are rarely understood immediately. Another pointed out that power is often revealed not by what leaders say, but by what they refuse to answer. The hearing, they agreed, would be studied for years, not for policy outcomes, but for psychological ones. Behind closed doors, aides and advisors scrambled to manage the fallout. Trump's team issued statements reframing the exit as principled resistance to disrespect. Obama's camp remained largely silent, releasing only a brief note emphasizing the importance of truth and civility. The contrast in responses mirrored the exchange itself, one loud and defensive, the other restrained and deliberate. As night fell over Washington, the city buzzed with speculation. Was this a turning point? Or just another viral moment in an already fractured political era? No one could say for certain. But something about the hearing felt different. It wasn't loud enough to be dismissed as spectacle. It wasn't dramatic enough to fade quickly. It lingered. In living rooms across the country, families argued about what they had seen. Some saw disrespect. Others saw courage. Many felt something harder to name, a discomfort that came from realizing how rarely leaders are forced to sit with unanswered questions. Children asked parents why the man had walked out. Parents struggled to explain without revealing their own uncertainty. The following morning, newspapers carried headlines that avoided specifics, instead focusing on themes: silence, truth, power tested. Editorials filled entire pages, some praising Obama's composure, others condemning the direction of the exchange. Critics countered that truth has no safe boundaries. The country split instantly, not over policy, but over principle. Inside the room, however, the divide felt different. It was quieter, more contemplative. A senator who had witnessed decades of hearings leaned back in his chair and whispered to a colleague that he had never seen anything like it. Not because of drama, but because of restraint. Because the most powerful moment had not been delivered with force, but with patience. Obama stood and addressed the room one final time before leaving. His voice remained steady, but there was a gravity to it now that hadn't been there before. He spoke about leadership as a burden rather than a prize. About the responsibility of facing uncomfortable truths, especially when they threaten pride. He did not mention Trump by name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew who, and what, he was referring to. When Obama exited the chamber, there was no applause. Not because people were unmoved, but because applause would have cheapened what had just occurred. Some moments demand reflection, not reaction. The doors closed behind him, and only then did the room begin to breathe again. In the hours that followed, the hearing dominated every broadcast. Clips of Trump's confident declarations were replayed alongside Obama's measured responses. But it was the question, simple, direct, unanswered, that became the focal point. Analysts paused footage at the exact moment Trump hesitated. They examined his posture, his eyes, the way his voice shifted. They contrasted it with Obama's stillness, his refusal to escalate. The contrast told a story no narration could improve. Social media erupted. Supporters on both sides flooded timelines with commentary. Some praised Trump's refusal to engage, calling it strength. Others saw it as proof that bravado collapses when confronted with accountability. Obama's supporters framed the moment as a masterclass in restraint. Critics accused him of manipulation. After Trump's abrupt departure, the room did not immediately return to motion. No one rushed to speak. No one stood. The usual choreography of political hearings, rebuttals, statements for the record, procedural reminders, felt suddenly irrelevant. What remained was an atmosphere thick with unresolved meaning. Senators sat frozen in place, their expressions unreadable. Some stared at the empty chair Trump had just left behind, as if expecting him to return and reclaim the moment. Others avoided looking at it altogether, aware that its emptiness now said more than any speech could have. The moderator cleared his throat, attempting to restore order, but his voice sounded smaller than before. The authority of the process had been shaken, not by shouting or chaos, but by silence. Obama gathered his papers slowly, not as someone eager to leave, but as someone allowing the moment to settle. His calm seemed almost out of place against the emotional charge in the room. It wasn't the calm of indifference. It was the calm of someone who understood that the most important words had already been spoken, and the most important response had not. Reporters began scribbling furiously, trying to capture not just what had happened, but what it meant. Some wrote about Trump's exit as an act of defiance. Others framed it as avoidance. But even as interpretations diverged, one fact united them all: the balance of the room had shifted. Power, which moments earlier had seemed loud and forceful, now felt fragile. The unanswered question echoed in every corner, repeating itself not through sound, but through absence. Outside the chamber, word spread quickly. Newsrooms lit up. Producers rewound footage again and again, slowing down the exchange, analyzing facial expressions, timing, pauses. Pundits debated whether Obama had crossed a line or simply revealed one that already existed. Supporters of Trump argued that personal questions had no place in national hearings. The doors closed. The sound was final. Obama remained seated. He looked around the room, not triumphant, not defeated. Just reflective. When he spoke again, it was to say that truth does not disappear when someone walks away from it. That silence can speak louder than argument. Then he stood, and the hearing ended. What followed would be debated endlessly. But in that room, at that moment, one thing was undeniable: a single question, asked without anger, had shifted everything. When Obama responded, he did not mirror Trump's intensity. He met it with restraint. He spoke calmly, questioning the idea that declaring success made it so. He spoke of families living on the edge, of unity measured not by slogans but by empathy. His words were not theatrical, but they landed with quiet force. The room shifted again. Trump interrupted. Obama waited. The dynamic became clear, one man pushing forward, the other holding ground. Then the exchange turned sharper. Trump moved away from policy and toward personal insinuation, reviving old accusations meant to provoke rather than clarify. Gasps rippled through the room. It was a calculated escalation, one designed to disrupt Obama's composure. But Obama did not react the way many expected. He didn't defend. He didn't retaliate. He paused. And in that pause, the room felt something change. Obama finally spoke again, his voice softer than before, but steady. He said that if honesty was truly the standard being demanded, then clarity should not be feared. He posed a single, pointed question, not shouted, not dramatized. Just asked. It was not the content alone that stunned the room, but the manner. Calm. Direct. Unavoidable. Trump's reaction was immediate and visible. His posture stiffened. His response deflected rather than answered. The room sensed it instantly. The question lingered, unanswered, hanging in the air like a held breath. Obama did not press with volume. He pressed with silence. In that moment, the hearing stopped being about political ideology. It became about composure under pressure. About whether truth is something to confront or evade. Trump grew defensive, accusing Obama of distraction, of cheap tactics. Obama remained still, repeating only that leadership is revealed in how one handles uncomfortable questions. The tension reached a breaking point. Trump abruptly stood, declaring the exchange a waste of time, his voice echoing sharply as he exited the room. Cameras followed. About the cost of ignoring realities that make us uncomfortable. As he spoke, the room responded subtly. Some leaned forward. Others sat rigid, arms crossed, unsure whether they agreed but unable to disengage. Obama's tone never rose. He didn't accuse. He described. He spoke of Americans who worked relentlessly yet felt stuck. Of systems that rewarded noise over substance. Of the temptation leaders faced to declare success rather than examine progress. His words were not sharp, but they were precise, and that precision unsettled more than anger ever could. Trump watched closely. At times he smirked. At times he tapped his fingers against the desk, a quiet rhythm betraying impatience. He was waiting for his opening, waiting to counter what he clearly viewed as pessimism dressed as principle. When Obama finished his opening remarks, the silence that followed wasn't polite, it was thoughtful. The kind of pause that suggests people are processing something they didn't expect to hear. Then Trump leaned forward and spoke. His voice filled the room immediately, confident and forceful. He dismissed Obama's remarks as dramatic and misguided, framing them as evidence of weakness rather than concern. He spoke in absolutes: success, winning, strength. He listed accomplishments rapidly, painting a picture of a nation thriving beyond criticism. Where Obama spoke of complexity, Trump offered certainty. Where Obama acknowledged struggle, Trump declared victory. The contrast was stark. Trump's words energized parts of the room while unsettling others. He mocked the idea that reflection was necessary, suggesting instead that constant optimism was leadership itself. He reframed division as resolve, doubt as disloyalty. His tone carried pride, but also challenge, a dare for anyone to contradict him openly. Moments later, the energy shifted. Donald Trump entered with a noticeable surge of motion, accompanied by aides who moved quickly, almost urgently. His presence changed the temperature of the room. He acknowledged familiar faces with nods and brief gestures, a subtle reminder that he thrived in attention. When he took his seat opposite Obama, the contrast was unmistakable. One man leaned back, arms loose but alert. The other remained upright, composed, waiting. The space between them felt charged, like a wire pulled tight. These were not strangers. They had shaped narratives about each other for years without sharing a room. Their disagreements had unfolded through speeches, interviews, and headlines, each interpreting America in radically different ways. Now, those years of indirect conflict had narrowed into a single table, a single moment. There would be no crowd rallies, no carefully edited sound bites. Only questions, answers, and the silence in between. The moderator opened with formalities, outlining the purpose of the hearing, a discussion on the nation's current condition, its challenges, and its direction. The word sounded neutral, but no one in the room believed neutrality would survive the hour. Obama gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Trump shifted in his seat, his posture signaling readiness rather than patience. Cameras zoomed in. Pens hovered above notepads. The atmosphere felt almost suspended, as if everyone was waiting for the first crack of thunder. Obama was given the floor first. He didn't rush. He adjusted the microphone slightly, took a small sip of water, and allowed a moment of silence to settle. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, controlled, and unmistakably clear. He began not with statistics or rebuttals, but with a concept: honesty. The word seemed simple, but in that room it carried weight. He spoke about truth not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. About the danger of confusing confidence with clarity. The moment the hearing was announced, Washington seemed to lean forward in anticipation. It wasn't written on any official schedule as a confrontation, yet everyone knew that was exactly what it would become. The air that morning carried a quiet chill, the kind that settles over the city when history is about to be argued, not celebrated. Outside the Capitol, cameras were aligned like soldiers, reporters packed tightly together, murmuring predictions that ranged from fireworks to disaster. No one expected calm. What they expected was spectacle. But inside the grand chamber, something deeper was forming, an encounter not just between two former presidents, but between two versions of truth itself. The hall filled long before the appointed hour. Senators took their seats with unusually restrained expressions. Staffers whispered less than usual. Even the most seasoned political observers sensed that this was not a routine exchange of rhetoric. The room itself felt heavier, as though the marble walls had absorbed decades of power struggles and were bracing for another. Two chairs sat at the center, facing each other under bright lights that revealed every detail, every twitch, every breath. Those chairs symbolized more than protocol. They represented two sharply opposed philosophies of leadership. Now stripped of distance, stripped of filters, Barack Obama entered first. There was no dramatic pause, no attempt to command attention. He simply walked in, steady and composed, carrying a thin folder that looked more symbolic than necessary. His movements were deliberate but unhurried, the kind of calm that suggested preparation rather than performance. As he took his seat, the room responded instinctively, voices lowered, movement slowed. He arranged his papers neatly, glanced once at the microphone, and then sat still, eyes forward. His expression held neither defiance nor eagerness. It was the expression of someone who knew exactly why he was there.